All right, open your Bible then to Acts 23. We will keep going. There's Bibles in the church, the chairs around you. So Paul, at the end of his third missionary journey, having received a vision from Jesus, who told him, I want you to go back to Jerusalem, and then I'm going to use that time in Jerusalem to then punch you on your way back to Rome. And it's not going to go easy, but I promise you, you won't die. There's a real nice promise, isn't it? Oh my. So he does it. And he goes to Jerusalem, and his friends try to get him not to do it, and he still does it, and it goes horribly just like he thought, and just like all his friends thought. And the Jews rush him, they try to grab him. I mean, they're literally going to tear him to pieces. The Romans come down from the Antonia fortress to save him. It's such a mob. There's so many people grabbing him. The Romans have to raise him above their head and, kind of try to run him out of the Temple Mount. On their way out, they get to the steps, and Paul goes, might I say just a couple more words? You think I like to talk? This guy's got me any day of the week. And he gives the first of two defense speeches in Jerusalem that goes horribly. It goes really well until he says, and God is using us to finally reach the Gentiles, and that doesn't sound really good to some of the Jewish leadership there. The mob scene starts again. They haul him up to the barracks in Rome to keep him safe. And eventually they're going to bring him back down now this morning and see if the Romans want to see if they can get the Sanhedrin together, the leaders of the Jews, and Paul together and work this crazy little disagreement out. And that's where we'll start our story this morning. And the text now from 23 to 26 starts to take on a kind of law and order kind of feel to it. So if you like a courtroom drama, which I personally love, courtroom dramas, you will love this next several weeks. And what happens is Luke starts out with the second now of Paul's defense speeches that he will give before the Sanhedrin now. That will be followed, which we will cover in the second half of our sermon this morning, by a very perilous trip to Caesarea that the Romans kind of sneak him out in the middle of the night to try to get him out of Jerusalem before they tear him to pieces. That will be followed in the coming weeks by three more defense speeches Paul will make as he sits in the capital of Judea, the Roman capital of Judea, which is Caesarea on the coast. He will make the first defense speech to Felix, the governor, the Roman governor. 2 years later, which we will just cover right away, another guy takes over as governor by the name of Festus, and he'll make a defense speech, and then Brian Fury is going to teach on the third defense speech, if you will, to the Jewish puppet king Agrippa II, which is a phenomenal scene. And that will be followed by the final perilous trip to Rome. And when I say perilous trip to Rome, that is wording it way too lightly. And for Paul, this is going to come up a lot this morning, for Paul, it's all about the hope of the resurrection, which is kind of a big phrase. And when we hear that, we think the resurrection of Jesus, which is only part of what that phrase means. And so we will explore that. It's not just a hope that as individuals, if we have bowed our knee to Jesus, that we will have an afterlife with God, though that is true. What Paul's audience, when they hear the resurrection of the dead, for a Jewish audience, what it really means is the long-awaited reign of the King God who will take over and start putting this world, messy, dark, chaotic place back together again. So let's begin in chapter 23 and verse 1. Paul, looking intently at the Sanhedrin, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." The high priest, Ananias, commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Rather a poor start, rather an abrupt start. Clearly there's been a little bit of a pre-meeting with the Sanhedrin. They're nice and worked up, lathered up before Paul comes down for this little powwow. This Ananias guy, he's the high priest. He's been the high priest since AD 47. So about, to this part of our story, if my chronology's right, he's been the high priest for about 10 years. He's got 2 years left. Then he's removed as the high priest. In 66 AD, he's murdered, by the way. So as you read this story, realize he sounds like he's there forever. He's not. He gets murdered, basically, for corroborating too much and collaborating with the Romans, and the Jews kill him. So he's quite short-lived. And this statement, strike him on the mouth, that's what you did in Judaism when somebody was blaspheming and lying. Verse 3. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you on the mouth. There's a nice retort to keep you out of trouble, right? God is going to strike you on the mouth, you whitewashed wall. We've heard this term because Jesus used this term, right, Michael, in Matthew 23. And Jesus didn't make it up. Jesus stole it from the great prophet Ezekiel in chapter 13. A whitewashed wall is a wall that looks like it's going to stand the test of time, but it's going to collapse at any moment, which is exactly what happens to Ananias. But the bystanders, Paul goes on to say, do you sit to try me according to the Torah and yet break the Torah by striking me? But the bystanders said, do you revile God's high priest? Verse 5. And Paul said, I'm sorry, I was not aware, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. There's a couple ways to look at Paul's response. You could say Paul's just being extremely sarcastic and saying, I couldn't tell he was the high priest because of all the sin in front of him. That's a possibility. Paul may be thinking that, but I don't think that's what Paul's saying. I think the fact that Paul so quickly jumps to an apology tells you Paul literally didn't know who he was talking to. And he feels so strongly about it, it's like, God, can you not see your own soul, dude? And they say, the dude is the high priest. Paul sees that immediately. Now, again, if my chronology is right, Paul has not been to Jerusalem for a long time. In fact, he probably hasn't been around a high priest for more than 20 years. Well, this guy's only been in position as high priest for 10. He doesn't know this guy. So he clearly is just making a mistake. And to me, this is awesome. Especially as men, we should be looking at this because we have the harder time with this concept. And if you want stories, my wife has about a million. Look how humble this guy is. He jumps on something. They say, you're not right. And he says, I'm wrong. I'm so sorry. I mean, he's so humble. We should ask ourselves if we react like this when the truth smacks us in the forehead. But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other part of the Sanhedrin were Pharisees, Paul began crying out to the Sanhedrin, brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial. And I'll insert this, not because of my interaction with the Gentiles. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. Now, all the way up until about 10 years from this discussion, there was a huge kind of schism, if you will, this divide, this great divide in the Sanhedrin, because it was made up of more than one type of Jew. There were Sadducees, and there were also Pharisees. They had a lot of theological difference, but there's one huge difference between these two groups. And we know this from the Gospels as well, but we also know it from outside Bible literature. The Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection of the dead. And Paul's tactic here, by the way, is not to get himself out of trouble. So you should hear in this, when Paul's in a pickle, this is not about self-preservation, which is what I normally go to. How am I going to get out of this? Oh my gosh, how did I get into this? Am I ever going to be cleared of this? Is this cloud ever going to lift from me? Just me, and there's none of this with Paul. Paul's tactic is not to get out of trouble. Paul wants to steer them somehow to Jesus as the main point. But he can't just jump there. And so he wants to discuss this whole topic of the resurrection from the dead. So his goal is twofold. He may have a secondary goal of making sure the Romans who are present in this little discussion he's having with the Sanhedrin look, this is not a political deal, this is a religious deal, so really you won't care about it. His bigger point, though, is to the Jews, that the long-awaited hope of God to put the wrongs to right with his King and Messiah is here. And this is a huge theme in the time of Paul, dating back several hundred years. Between the period where the Old Testament is done being written and Jesus comes on the scene, it's just under 400 years. We typically refer to this in history as the intertestamental period, the time between the two testaments, the Old and the New. During this intertestamental period, because they've been exiled by Assyria in the north, they then got exiled and beat up by Babylon in the south, they're being now oppressed, they were oppressed by Greece, now they're oppressed by Rome, it's just horrible. They started clinging to God, bring your appointed Messiah. You can't wait anymore, God. You've got to come, you've got to come. So during these 400 years, it is a huge push for reading the prophetic texts of the Old Testament. And one book in particular that Derek will explain to you in detail any day you want, and that is the book of Daniel. We taught it in Journey not long ago. And in Daniel, there are very specific references to the time when God would bring the new creation. He would bring the new humanity, and he would raise those who are dead to life in a new creation. And in particular, in Daniel chapter 12, and this is a series in and of itself, Derek would tell you, but we will just read it. Now at that time, Michael the archangel, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of his people, meaning Israel, will arise. So the great protector of Israel, Michael, will come, the angel. And there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation. Derek is teaching about this now upstairs in Revelation. Until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground, meaning those who have died, who are in this wait period, will awake to an everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. And those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, the glory of God literally pouring out of people that know Jesus. And those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. This is what the Pharisees were studying. This is what the Pharisees clung to, that God would take every person they've ever known that has passed away, that has known God, there's all kinds of disagreement about what this means, but many people believe they're asleep for a period of time, which is but a moment for them, and they awake in the presence of God, and God will renew all things, that there's a resurrection, if you will, from the dead. The Pharisees felt so strongly about this, it's even written about in the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, they say this, that if there is no resurrection of the dead prescribed in the Torah, they have no share in the life to come. There is nothing left if there's no resurrection from the dead, is what the Pharisees believe. If God is not going to make this thing right, then kill me now. Haven't you felt like that? Honestly, I don't know. People that don't know God relationally, I don't know how you get out of bed. I really don't. I mean that just seriously. Because there's days when I don't want to get out of bed and I know God. Right? How about we skip this one? It feels just terrible. I can tell what's going to happen this week. It's not going to be good. I love sleeping anyway. We've got this new bed. I mean, it raises on each side for old people. My wife and I love it. Let's just call the week off, right? But if God is coming again, if God now, as Jesus came already, and he rules in the heavens, and he's ruling on the earth, and with each footprint is renewing life, he's raising the dead, if you will, that I can get out of bed for. This is the hope of Israel since the time of Abraham. And because it's Israel's hope, it's the hope of the world that God will bring a new creation about. Verse 7. As he said this, there occurred a dissension That's putting it lightly, by the way. Between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, Paul has sided with the Pharisees. The Pharisees go, you know what? You just reminded me what the real problem here is. It's not Paul. It's these Sadducees who don't think God is faithful enough to come back and actually make this right again. And the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. This is a weird piece of language. But during this period of time, anyone that believed, by the way, that there was an ultimate resurrection knew that God would somehow raise those who had already died. And they had a way of speaking this. There was a language. The Pharisees would refer to it as an angelic kind of state. They would also refer to it as the Spirit would come back. They had a language that they developed primarily from studying the book of Daniel. Acts chapter 23, verse 9. And there occurred a great uproar. This is the word for a mob riot, by the way. And some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. This is the Pharisees, by the way. We were so off, I think, from the Pharisees. They were off, but they were so near to finding the truth. They were the keepers of the identity of Israel. This is why Jesus argued with the Pharisees so much, because they were so close. This is why so many Pharisees actually came to believe in Jesus after he resurrected. Tons of Pharisees came to Jesus. I mean, look at this perspective. We better be careful, because this may not be about Paul. God may be trying to speak to us. I mean, that is heady stuff. And as a great dissension was developing, the commander of the Roman army was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. Verse 11. But on the night immediately following, the Lord, this means Jesus, shows up again, and he stood at Paul's side and he said to him, take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness in the same way in Rome as well. How cool is this? God never sleeping. God ever aware of the turmoil that we feel, the anxiety we feel at times, the darkness that closes in on us, the loss of hope that we feel, the things that we pray would not happen to Bev as she sits in that hospital bed, by the way. That God comes to him and says, I'm still here. Don't lose sight. And I love it. Paul is not trying to get out of this. He's trying to create an and. Right? He can argue his way out of this. He's very bright, but he has no desire to do that. He desires to testify of Jesus no matter how big a pickle it gets him in. Somehow, with beatings and death literally facing him, people grabbing at him to tear him to pieces, all Paul sees is the people in front of him that need Jesus. How does he do this? I mean, somehow Paul is so deeply affected in this moment by the experience of the love and nature and presence of God and the realness and liveness of God in his life that he doesn't see his issue, he sees the issue with the person in front of him. Right? This is what Paul does every day. And this is what we're supposed to do every day. There's only one question. We wake up and we say, God, do you love me? Are you for me? We have to know this every day. Maybe the way we say it is, we need to re-know this on a daily basis. God, are you on my side? Can I rely on you to be here with me? And it will carry us. The experience of what God does in our life is so deep. If it can do this for Paul in the face of death, where he doesn't see the death, he sees the death before him, and the people that need resurrection themselves. If this can do this for Paul, it'll do the same for you and I. Verse 12. When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under an oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore, you and the Sanhedrin notify the commander, go tell the commander, the Roman commander, to bring Paul down to you, as though you were just going to determine his case by some more investigation. And then on his way down, we'll rip him apart and kill him." That's a pretty good plan. This is hatred, huh? Vowing to the death to kill Paul. This is dark, dark stuff. Luke will let us know a few verses later that the chief priests and the elders are going right along with this. Now, the rest of our story this morning, I want to make a shift. The rest of our story this morning is the Romans trying to sneak Paul out of Dodge to save him, to get him to Caesarea. And there's something important I want to remember as we do this that kind of screws us up. We already know what's going to happen here. And we already know it partly because some of you read this before, which you weren't supposed to, by the way. You're the people that go to the bookstore, go to the back, read the end, go, okay, it ends the way I want, then you go back to the front, you already know the end. We also already know the end because Jesus has already told Paul the end. You're not going to die in Israel, right? So we know the end. But the problem with that knowledge is it lulls us to sleep on what God actually does for the rest of the passage that we're going to read. And I think you'll agree with me when I say this. Normally, you don't really know in your own life when chaos hits what's going to happen, because normally you don't have Jesus showing up in a vision in the middle of the night saying, "Let me draw you a map." Would you all agree with me in this?
Yeah.
Other than Jeff Clipness, for the rest of us, this usually doesn't happen. But somehow we need to take that aside then and see how God does this so that we can see Jesus in the vision speaking to us. Because he does do this. He does it through something in the Word. I hear this all the time. "Doug, did you write the sermon just for me this morning?" Which is just absurd, right? Like I know anything, right? God encouraging you with the Word. Or he might do that through a friend, by somebody saying something specific that you might need. He might do it through an action of something that you saw. You know, this friend this doctor I visited this week, he was on a sailboat in Mexico, and he was just kind of wrestling and struggling. He went on the bow, and then this seagull just came and just danced in front of him for 15 minutes. He said he was just bawling. This Catholic doctor, right? Just bawling on the front of this boat. It was like a scene out of Titanic, I suppose. And he said, God was just trying to let him, I'm here. So what I want you to do for the remainder of the story now in the next 10 minutes is I want you to pretend you do not know what's going to happen, which will match your own life, by the way. And what we're going to do is we're going to work on training ourselves to see God. I hear this all the time from people. You know, other people talk about how God shows up all the time. They're always seeing his thumbprint everywhere. I don't see that. Well, the answer is God is showing up. You're just not trained to see it. And I don't say that out of guilt or shame. I don't say that to make you feel bad, but it's a reality. We need to train ourselves to see the kingdom of God. This is what Jesus said. To see and to hear the kingdom of God. Most of the world says, what a coincidence. And my answer to that is? I think not. And my answer to that is?
I don't think so.
I think not. Coincidence?
I don't think so.
I want you to have that in your mind. It's the great and as we read the rest of these sections. Look at verse 16. But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul, and boy, if you're not seeing it there's something wrong with you this morning. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, lead this young man to the commander over you, for he has something to report to him. So he took the boy and led him to the commander and said, Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to lead this young boy to you, since he has something to tell you. And the commander took him by the hand and, stepping aside, began to inquire of the boy privately, what is it that you want to tell me? Now, look at I mean, there's thumbprints everywhere. First of all, who is this kid? The son of Paul's sister just so happens to show up, just happens to overhear the plot, happens to do this. Boy, he's just coincidentally in the right place. Could you explain that all away? Absolutely. Now, by the way, we've never heard of any family members of Paul until this point. Luke just jumps in and says, apparently Paul's got a family. We've never heard of a family member other than maybe indirectly about his lineage. So apparently, when Paul moved to Jerusalem as a boy from Tarsus, his sister moved there. She was also raised in Jerusalem. She got married in Jerusalem. She has kids. And lo and behold, the kid just happened to hear the right thing at the right time. And amazingly enough, the centurion lets the boy actually tell him the story and listens to the story. And on top of that, the centurion has the you-know-whats to go to the commander and tell him some crazy story about a boy, and the commander listens to him as well. That is just nuts. Those are thumbprints that any one of us on any day could completely miss. And then you know what your day is? Your day is chaotic and disconnected and lacking any form of the resurrection from the dead. When all day long, in Paul's day, God has been involved in the resurrection from the dead. Verse 20. And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow so the boys relate the story to the Sanhedrin, as though they were going to inquire somewhat thoroughly about it. But don't listen to them. Can you imagine this little boy, by the way, telling this story? Don't listen to them. The commander over the Roman cohort he's talking to, this little Jewish boy. For more than 40 of them are lying in wait for Paul, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, tell no one that you have notified me of these things. I mean, isn't it amazing the son actually even goes through with this? Can't you see him at that moment going, nothing. I was actually totally wrong. I have nothing to tell you. Can you imagine this little Jewish boy standing before this Roman commander of the cohort, dressed in full tilt, going, I got a story to tell you. I mean, he goes through with it, and the commander then lets the boy go. Caesarea, by the way, which we'll look at, is a little bit of a distance. Verse 23. He called to him 2 of the centurions, his managers, if you will, and he says, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night, and proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They were able to provide mounts to put Paul on, so he didn't have to walk, and bring him safely to Felix the governor in Caesarea. Caesarea is, again, the Roman seat of government. It's where they ruled from. Caesarea is about 70 miles away. It's a long way away. This is where Pontius Pilate ruled from, and he would come back and forth like Felix would. Look at the sheer size of this cohort. I mean, again, you can explain this away by saying, well, Paul's a Roman citizen. They've got to protect him. You can explain this away. Does he need this many? And horses and spearmen? Remember, these are Jewish priests that they're running from. The Romans, for heaven's sake. Again, anything in life can be explained away, unless you have eyes to see and ears to hear it. Verse 25. And the commander wrote the letter in this form. Claudius Lysias is my name, to the most excellent Governor Felix. Greetings. When this man Paul was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came to them, and the troops rescued him, and having learned that he was a Roman, and wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. At this point, you should be saying, boys, leaving out some key details. This is the guy that threw the Roman citizen in chains and paraded him around illegally and was going to scourge him, by the way. No need to mention that. And I found him to be accused over questions about the Torah, about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So all of this stuff, they get to Antipatris, which is, they're not sure, it's about 35 miles, it's about a halfway point. Some of the soldiers start falling off, as we'll see. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul through the night to Antipatris. And the next day, leaving the horsemen to go with them, they returned to the barracks. And when these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. So we're introduced to this guy, Felix. He's a fascinating guy, by the way. He was actually, in history, a slave. So he's not a part of the Roman aristocracy, which would usually be in the ruling class of Rome. The way he got freed, most historians believe, was that his brother, Pallas, was actually in the Roman imperial court. He got him out of slavery, got him through the ranks to the point where he was actually the governor of Judea. So he's an interesting character because, in one sense, he's this kind of just guy that was raised in the dregs, and now he's given power without the education to handle it. The historian Tacitus describes him this way, that Felix practiced every form of cruelty and lust, wielding the power of a king with all the inside of a slave. He was known in his time of ruling for just insurrection after insurrection, which he would beat down with brutal force, which just made the Jews more mad, so they would create more insurrections, so he would beat them down even farther. He was a brutal guy, which leads me to number 7, and you'll wonder, why would I say this is the thumbprint of God? Because you won't see it this morning, but you will see it in the next few weeks. Look at the nut job God hands Paul over to. I mean, you think, right? So this could be Beverly in her hospital, like, this ain't good, right? But there's an and to this. You won't see it this morning, but there's a huge and. Like, of all the people God, even Paul might be thinking, really? This guy's a lunatic. And this is how you're going to keep me safe? It's actually exactly how he keeps him safe. Verse 34. When he had read it, meaning Felix, he asked from what province Paul was from. And when he learned he was from the region of Cilicia, that's the region of Cilicia where Tarsus is, he said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Now, one last point before we close, and that is, in Roman law, in Cilicia in particular, it was not a requirement that they return the prisoner to his homeland. So the Roman law is actually working in Paul's favor, so he doesn't get shipped out to yet another place. The Roman law is keeping Paul in his homeland. And you might ask me, how is that a good thing? You will see that also in the next couple of weeks on what God does with this. And so what I want to do is close with this, and then Greg's going to come up and lead a time of body life. But it's this whole idea, again, Paul just gave the sermon away already, which is so beautiful. It's the great and. This is what we need to train ourselves for, people. This is one of the reasons we study the story of the Bible, so that we can see that the same faithful, loving, pursuing God of Paul is our God too, if we know him personally. And we can rely on him, so that when the chaotic form hits our life, we can look for the and. We look for the thumbprint. I mean, I've still told this story so many times. You know, I worked for Pac Bell a million years ago. I had the worst boss anybody could ever have. And Brian Fury and I both agree, everybody needs to have one horrible boss in their life. It's so good, because then you just realize how good you have it the rest of your life. This guy was a tyrant, and it was like a movie. His pockets were filled with keys and coins and, I don't know, spurs. I don't know what were in there. And I had this room. It wasn't a big room. It was maybe a little bigger than, twice the size of the stage. And all my subordinates were in this room. Half of them were believers. In fact, we had our own little Bible study we do once a week. I was discipling one of the guys that worked for me. And every day the door would open. And I would just hear Clint Eastwood coming down. It was just awful. And my heart was just going to my gullet. And I would just swing my chair at my cubicle and just wait for just the tongue lashing. And just absurdity and ranting and raving. He wanted to rid all my employees. They were great people. So I'm trying to protect them against this just mad lunatic. Every day at 10 and 3, I learned this from Brian. I would leave for 10 minutes and go on a walk and pray. God, where are you? I need an hand. Where's your thumbprint? Because this guy's wrecking my life. And as you know, all the money in the world, the best paycheck in the world, and even a good job does not overcome a lousy boss. Right? They can make your life a living hell. Amen?
Amen.
I went water skiing one weekend with my wife and family, another family. While I was gone, he got in a fist fight, 35-year employee, with the sales vice president in the general manager's office, unbeknownst to me, and got fired for violence in the workplace. This is how Doug gets promoted, by the way. Not hard to stay humble in this guy's skin suit. I walked in and I heard this just woo, woo, woo. I'm thinking, what is that? It's like 8 in the morning. Woo! So bad. The janitor was trying to get the blood stains out of the carpet. Can you imagine 2 grown 50, 60-year-old men just beating the tar at each other? And God going, I told you how to handle this thing, Doug. By the way, coincidentally, my wife and I had just had a conversation. We were going under $1,000 a month after we built our house. And she said to me, in June, we got to sell the house. And I said, let's pray about it for 3 months. Which really meant I got a month. This was a week or 2 before the 3 months were up. And I got this massive raise. And I looked at my wife and said, coincidence?
I think not.
And she said, but it's still not enough to make it for $1,000. Darn. A month later, my old boss called me and said, we want to hire you for yet another promotion. And my boss said, we'll match it each day. In the phone company, I got a 33% raise in 2 months. Coincidence?
I think not.
Could you explain it away? Yeah, I got to get the tar to the guy in the office. Plenty of explanations. My wife and I love doing eating out ministry. That's what I call it. The gospel in 5 minutes. I just love getting to know the help in a restaurant. It's just a favorite of mine. Anybody that eats in mine restaurants, which is a lot, knows I just love this. I love getting in their lives. I love finding out. We eat at a particular place that I won't mention almost every Saturday morning for breakfast, really late, like 10 or 11 breakfast after we walk together and ride and do all this exercising. And we've gotten to know just so many of these employees, and we know parts of their lives, and some of you eat with me, and you know their lives because you're doing this with me, and this one gal who just love this gal. Her life's just kind of a good and a tragic mess. She dated this guy, he's just a horrible dude. My wife, she'll just sit with a crowded restaurant, just sit down, and then my wife just pours into her. So tell me about this relationship. So, you're a great gal. What are you doing with this guy? Drug dealer. What are you doing with him? So we walked into the restaurant. We've known her for a year. And just to be a smart aleck, she was at the cash register. And because I like just the creepy, I just put my chin on her shoulder. Just kind of, she's just kind of not in a good place. So I walk back to my table, thinking nothing of it. About a half an hour later, here she comes. She pulls up the chair and she sits down. Her eyes just fill with tears. She said, what's up? She said, well, you haven't seen me in a couple weeks. I said, you said, no. She said, my boyfriend got killed a week ago. Shocked over a drug. And partly, I hate to say it, partly my wife and I are saying, well, we feel bad, but thank God. I mean, it's just horrible, God. Horrible, God. You get shot with a red drug deal. I mean, you're not exactly an angel. And she's a neat gal, right? But succumbing to more darkness. And we just sat and just listened and loved. Linda was so careful. She wanted to say so much. She said just the phrase, And we were going to leave, and all of a sudden I look around, my wife, usually it's me that's gone, because I've already made another best friend just trying to leave the restaurant. And now Linda's gone. And she finally joins me about a minute later. I said, well, where are you? She said, I just haven't talked to her. It's a dark, chaotic world. Jesus is the beginning of the resurrection. He is the inaugurator of the resurrection. He is the alpha of the resurrection. We are also the resurrection of Jesus, where God is bringing life to death. And I assure you, if you knew me before the age of 18, I would be dead in my sin. And I bowed my knee to Jesus and I said, I've tried everything else, let's give you a shot. How's that for stability? And he said, I can work with that. Now let's start looking for the end. Right?